Okay, looks like we're set. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, they say all good things are worth waiting for, right? So, Mr. Tony Robledo, after completing 5 years of active duty as an Army officer in the Medical Service Corps, joined the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency for Region 6 in 1990, and was first assigned as a Superfund enforcement officer. In 1995, he accepted a position in the Clean Air Act Enforcement Section as an air enforcement officer. In 2003, he was selected by the EPA to participate in the U.S. Embassy Science Fellows Program. As a part of this program, Tony completed a 1-month tour in the country of Bahrain, assisting their Environmental Affairs Department. Tony has successfully completed numerous leadership assignments at EPA and is currently a Senior Clean Air Act Inspector Enforcement Officer assigned to the Chemical Accident Enforcement Section, Air Enforcement Branch, Enforcement and Compliance Assurance Division at EPA Region 6, and works exclusively conducting risk management inspections with the aid of optical gas imaging and handles risk management enforcement cases. His education includes a bachelor's degree from the School of Science and University of Texas at Arlington and a master's degree in management from Weber University, St. Louis, Missouri. Tony also serves as an adjunct instructor at the University of Texas at Arlington Environmental Training Institute. I don't think I can even give more accolades than what we just read. So we're going to let Mr. Tony come up and talk to you guys about a very interesting time.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. Appreciate it. Glad we got the technical things worked out.
Yes, sir.
It's a little bit hard to do PowerPoint with that PowerPoint presentation, but yeah, I know this is great to be back here again at the HSE Conference. Recognize quite a few of y'all from years in the past, so looking forward to meeting you all even after all the events that are planned. I know it's a little tough after lunch, but I'm sure we'll make it. Try to make it a little interesting here. So this is really going to be talking about the risk management program. And I call it 101 because this is really kind of like just like an introduction, kind of just a really good idea of how this program works. So we're going to take a little journey. We'll look at some history. We'll obviously look at the regulations. As you all know, EPA is a regulatory agency, just like our state partners have regulatory agencies for Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. So we'll look at it from the regulatory perspective. We'll look at a brief case study at the end, and hopefully that'll kind of bring this all together so we have some impact there. Now, we are out of EPA Region 6. The headquarters of the regional office is in Dallas. We cover the 6 states of Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico. So that's really our area of jurisdiction for our region. So starting off with some history, we will go ahead and look at an incident that really kind of triggered this whole risk management program for the regulations. And it started in Bhopal, India in December 1984. And this was actually 38 years ago that this particular facility, this is Union Carbide pesticide plant in Bhopal, India, released approximately 30 tons of highly toxic gas called methyl isocyanate that killed 3,787 people and left thousands with long-term health effects. So the cause of this disaster occurred when water entered a tank containing methyl isocyanate, which caused a chemical reaction, and that released carbon dioxide and methyl isocyanate gas into the night, and that's what caused this tragedy. Very significant, very tragic event that happened globally. But people in the United States were starting to look at this and determine, could something like this happen in the United States? So it wasn't only industry asking that sort of question, it was also the regulators at the federal and state level asking those questions. And then we had community people also asking those same questions. Could something happen, something this tragic, this terrible happen in the United States? Now, EPA is also, just to mention, we cover, I mentioned the states, but there's also a focus on environmental justice communities. A lot of those are around facilities. So they're the ones that were really kind of vocal about this and making sure, do we have the proper regulations to take, if something were to happen this catastrophic, how would the regulatory agencies deal with that? So we're going to walk through a little bit of the regulations just to give you a feel from the Clean Air Act perspective. Now, this is the Clean Air Act, Section 7, which is part of the chemical accident prevention provisions. This was really started, Congress, as we know, they're the ones that make the laws. They're the ones that put this out. So we'll talk a little bit about general duty clause, who that impacts, how it works, and then we'll talk about the Chemical Safety Board. And just to mention briefly about the Chemical Safety Board, which some of y'all may be familiar with in your industry, they're not a regulatory agency. They're out there to investigate and make recommendations based on disasters. So I just wanted to point that out, and we'll talk at the end with a case study that they put together. So they're a scientific investigative organization. You might have seen some of their videos. They do put videos out that are very good. It's kind of explaining how incidents happen and how companies can learn from that. And then we'll talk about the risk management program, and that's really kind of the nuts and bolts of how the R&P program works. What are some of the citations, what to be looking for if you're out there in the field. General duty clause, and I've just put the definition up there just to make sure that everybody understands what this is, and I'll underline some of the specifics on this. So this is a regulation. It's authorized really to prevent accidental releases. Remember we talked about the Bhopal, India incident. So this regulation came out in 1990. So it's a few years after the 1984 Bhopal incident, but Congress specifically wanted this regulation out to prevent accidental releases of any substance, whether it's an extremely hazardous substance, which is also EHS. And there's also, we'll go into some of the, well, I'll tell you where these chemicals are located at in the Code of Federal Register. But it requires owners and operators that produce, store, process, handle, again, store chemicals, and they're required to make sure that they have, that they're really responsible to maintain a safe facility. And this section 654 of Title 29, that specifically requires, it states that the employer shall furnish to each of its employees a place of employment which is free from recognized hazards that caused or likely to cause death or serious harm, and that the employer shall comply with the occupational safety and hazard standards under this particular regulation. So it sort of references some of the OSHA requirements. Now, OSHA, when you think about OSHA, they're concerned more about the process safety management regulations, and those are ones that are going to impact workers, where EPA is going to be, it also has some overlap with some of those PSM regulations. Our focus is going to be more on offsite impact and things like that, but we do have some overlap with those regulations also. So who is covered by the general duty clause? And really, this is a broad regulation, general. It really covers any stationary source producing, processing, or handling, storing regulated substances or extremely hazardous substances. So you may say, what are those substances? Well, there's a whole list of them, and they're identified in 40 Code of Federal Registers, Part 68. And there's also other extremely hazardous substances you might think about. Some of them are obvious toxics, flammables. And I know oil and gas refinery sectors have plenty of flammables, whether it's be propane, butane, either 1,3-butadiene. I mean, there's a whole list of these, methane. So it focuses those flammables, but also chemicals that have acute health effects. Think about carcinogens specifically, like benzene, chemicals like that have a very significant impact on people's health. Another couple of ones that you might not think of that are extremely hazardous are dust. And we have seen explosions in the United States caused by dust, whether it be at a paper mill or whether it be at a sugar mill. Sometimes you've got dust from those factories producing inside an enclosed area, and it just takes a spark or something, and you've got a flammable situation. Water is another one that you probably wouldn't think about, but when you think about steam and the impact it can have on individuals, on equipment, the environment, that can also be extremely hazardous substance. So the requirements of the general duty clause, and of course, this is a very broad umbrella here, but it has to do with the company is, or remember, stationary source, any stationary source, to identify hazards that may result with the accidental release of extremely hazardous substances using the appropriate hazard assessment techniques. And we'll talk a little bit about those hazard assessment techniques here in a little bit. And then they've also got to design and maintain a safe facility and to prevent releases. Now, these are really things that you think every facility should follow. And of course, you want to have a design and maintain a safe facility. And then should something occur, the regulation requires to minimize those consequences should an accident or incident occur at the facility. So the emphasis here is really any stationary source for any extremely hazardous substance in any quantity, whether it's below a threshold or above the threshold. So this is now, so we talked about general duty. Now we're going to talk about, as I mentioned, really the meat of the program, really the heart of the R&P program, which is 112R7. And that has a requirement for hazard assessments, which is really making sure that there is ways to prevent accidental releases and to make sure there's an accident or accidental history noted by the facility, and then evaluations of certain worst case and alternative release scenarios. Now, one of the tools that EPA has developed, and many industries use this to develop to identify a worst case scenario, is a program software called R&P Comp, which some of y'all may have heard about it. You can download it for free at EPA. And what it does, it gives you the specific place when you input the chemicals, the amount of chemicals for your facility, then it'll give you an endpoint of what the radius, or it'll give you the endpoint so you can figure out what the radius of impact for that release of the chemical is. So hazard assessment is really critical for a risk management program. Prevention program. So we're talking about safety preventions, maintenance monitoring, employee training measures. All those things are critical. One of the key components is that this regulation requires companies to produce process hazard analysis, where you get a team of people in that know the facility, know the process, and then you specifically go through what they call nodes to actually figure out what could be a potential problem. Procedures is critical part of this prevention program, because if a facility were to say start a new process or do something different, those procedures would have to match what that equipment is, so the operator would know exactly what the next step is to do in operating that equipment. And we have seen incidences where something has changed, but the operations for doing that work is not translated in their procedures to the operator. Another key component of prevention is mechanical integrity, and that'll kind of fall into our case study here in a little bit. But mechanical integrity really just comes down to inspections and making sure that covered process equipment is inspected according to what EPA and OSHA were called REGAGAP. It's an acronym which stands for Recognized and Generally Accepted Good Engineering Practices. So if you ever hear that term, REGAGAP, that's what it stands for. Recognized and Generally Accepted Good Engineering Practices. Those are the standards that we would require the facility to follow. Now, those REGAGAP requirements could be, it could be an API standard, it could be an ASME standard, it could be some other standard, but they would be required to follow those standards. And then, of course, written emergency response programs would have to be spelled out and make sure that employees are trained and that the public is aware of what the response would be, and there's coordination and communication with local fire department. The regulation requires a written emergency plan for these facilities that are subject to the RMP. And again, they got to notify the public, and they have to coordinate with the LEPC, which is the Local Emergency Planning Committee, which is really just like a group of industry people that include citizens, to make sure they're aware of the emergency response procedures. So there's levels of risk management program. Program 1 is really just for low risk type of facilities that may not infect the public. Program 2 is a little bit more streamlined. There's a little bit more hazardous assessment that's required, a little bit more management. They're still required to do the emergency response requirements. And then program 3 is the highest level, and that's the one that requires very rigorous prevention program and maintaining hazardous management and emergency response requirements. So the way I think of this is program 1 is low risk, program 2 is medium risk, and program 3 is high risk. Now, EPA focuses on the high risk facilities. So those are the ones that are going to be the major natural gas plants, major refineries, things like that. So it is important to note that the RMP is a document-heavy regulation. So there's plenty of documents that the facility has to maintain and update according to EPA, and those are all to identify the concerns of the facility. And the way, and I mentioned the focus of program 3, when we inspect a facility within Region 6, we're really going out in the field where some of our steps include notifying the facility ahead of time, because as I mentioned, this is a document heavy regulation. So we go ahead and give advance notice so we can have the documents ready to look at when we arrive. We provide the company with a checklist of what those requirements are. It's like a 16-page checklist. And then we also use optical gas imaging to look for leaks. And I know if you've been out with the exhibits, you've probably seen a lot of the OGI technology. We use that for some of these risk management inspections. Then we review all these documents. We put a report together which identifies areas of concern. Then we send that back to the facility, and then it goes on for a compliance review. The other thing I just wanted to note is when we complete a program 3 regulatory inspection, after we make sure with the facility that the facts are correct, then we go ahead and post that report on the web, not only for this program, but really all enforcement actions and inspections are posted on the web. So the public, communities, regulated community can also be able to have that information also. Now this slide, I just wanted to just show you some of the differences here between the GDC and the RMP differences. Now, you know, one of them would be the RMP again is a Part 68 program. So the GDC deals with stationary sources with listed substances or other extremely hazardous substances. And then RMP deals with those listed chemicals that are identified in the CFR section 68.130. And that's above threshold quantity. So some of these chemicals, and most of them for natural gas, refineries, petrochemical facilities, most of those thresholds amounts are like 10,000 pounds and above. For some of the toxics, for example, chlorine has a lower threshold quantity of like 2,500 pounds. So it kind of differs. There is a difference based on the certain chemicals you have. I just wanted to show you just some examples. These are actual examples, some of the findings that we have found out in the field. I'm not going to read all of these, but I'll just highlight some of these. And again, you know, general duty applies to any facility. Think about design and maintaining a safe facility. We've seen companies with not having the proper lightning protection. So if you think about, you know, starting a fire, explosion, something like that, not having that is not designed and maintain a safe facility. There's our rigor gap under the second bullet there. We've seen that failure to maintain the rigor gap. Failure to maintain operating procedures is another common GDC violation. And then safety issues like driving machinery. And this, you know, I talked a little bit about some of the overlap between OSHA, PSM, and RMP. We have seen incidences where facilities got somebody driving around with a forklift, they puncture a cylinder or something, and then you got an incident. So OSHA is concerned about the worker. If the worker got injured, you know, we're looking again at offsite impact, what the danger was, things like that. And the same thing with PPE. There are procedures for PPE, and we all know that term now that we're hopefully moving out of the COVID stuff, but personal protective equipment is critical to be followed, and the procedures of what an individual is supposed to wear when they're doing a particular piece of, you know, type of work is critical, not only for EPA, for the RMP program, but it's also critical for the OSHA requirements. These are some of the examples. Again, I'm not going to read all these, but these are some of the specific like violations, areas of concern that we've identified under Part 68 requirements of the 40 CFR regulations. Inadequate operations, you know, not having the proper documentation for training is common. Not having a system to address findings and recommendations. Not having an emergency response plan. Facilities are going to be required to have an emergency response plan. Offsite consequence analysis is another common one, and that would be a failure to perform a worst case scenario or an alternative release scenario, and not looking at all the issues associated with all their flammables or all their toxics. Failure to have a hazardous review is something that's also common. And then compliance audits. Under Part 68, facilities are required to conduct a internal audit every 3 years. And this is an opportunity where a facility can actually look at all of their RMP processes as far as, hazard assessment, looking at mechanical integrity, looking at their hazardous analysis, looking at their emergency response plan, and seeing if any of that needs to be updated. Just a quick overview of some stats here for Region 6. I mentioned that, we covered the 5-state area. So we have approximately, over 2,000 facilities covered under the risk management program, which is almost 20% of the national total. So Region 6, as many of you all know, covers a large percentage of the petroleum production, like about 75%, 50% of refinery capacity, and then 70% of oil and natural gas production. So, each year EPA experiences about 2,000 accidental releases. Now, this is within Region 6, again, the 5-state area. So you do the math on that, it comes out to like about 5 or 6, averages about 5 or 6 incidents a day. So the other thing to note about this is facilities are required to report a release, and that release is reported to the National Response Center. Now, we have a team of folks in our region that specifically looks at National Response Center incidents, and we're looking for those ones, like I mentioned earlier, program fee facilities, large facilities, and large releases that would cause death, injury, or evacuation. Those are the ones that really kind of rise to the top fairly quickly. This is just a map to show you where everything is located within the United States as far as natural gas processing plant. You see the large clusters along the coastline, Texas and Louisiana. But then if you're familiar with some of the natural gas shale plays, there's the Barnett Shale in Central Texas. There's the Eagle Ford, which is South Texas. There's just shale plays really in every region or every state. In our region has a big chunk of those. This is the case study, and hopefully we can put some of this together, what we talked about here. And I'll just give you the accident description here. This happened at Enterprise Pascagoula gas plant, explosion of fire. This happened in Moss Point, Mississippi. This occurred in June 27, 2016, and then there was a final report issued by the CSB, Chemical Safety Board, in February of 2019. So this was classified as a chemical distribution fire and explosion. And again, it was investigated by the CSB. So just a little background about this plant, and I don't have, that's one picture there. We'll see another one here in a little bit. So this plant had a design capacity of 1.5 billion cubic feet per day of raw natural gas and up to 50,000 barrels per day of natural gas liquids. At the time of the incident, natural gas throughput was approximately 50 million standard cubic feet per day and about 16,000 barrels per day of natural gas liquids. And of course, the CSB investigated this incident. So this is just an incident synopsis. I'll just highlight some of the things here. So this happened at night, and when you look at a lot of incidents, there are a lot of incidents that happen at night or when there's not enough people around. So that's something to just make note of. But so this has started with, I see 2 people were at the control board. There was the operator was at the control board, and then there was an operator outside. So they were stopping production of natural gas liquids due to a pipe pipeline problems downstream. So this was not, although this was a non-routine activity, the operators had experience conducting this procedure. As you remember, some of the incidents that I talked about, some of the examples, it's when operators don't follow procedures. So in this case, it looks like these operators followed the procedures. So the operators initiated necessary steps from the control room when they heard a sudden explosion and fire occurred. So there was no warning, basically, no alarms, no indicators that there was any problems at the facility. They just, boom, heard fire, felt the heat and everything. So within minutes of the explosion, operators activated the emergency shutdown system at the plant and sheltered in the control room. This is another critical procedure thing. It looks like these operators didn't panic. It looks like they knew what to do. They didn't immediately run out. They sheltered in place, and that possibly could have saved their lives, possibly. So over the course of this incident, there was 13 different ruptures of piping and equipment, and the CSB concluded that the first loss of the containment was most likely the brazed aluminum heat exchanger, which we'll talk a little bit more about there, and a loss of mechanical integrity. So fortunately, with this incident, there was no deaths or serious injuries, but there was an investigation. There's also, for you people like to look at YouTube, I know a lot of people like to look at YouTube, there is a video from a newscaster on how some of the citizens reacted to this explosion, and there was one citizen saying that she knew it was just a matter of time before something bad happened at this facility. And then this is just some of the before and after. So you can see some of the damage that was caused about this with the fire explosion. So Enterprise reported 104,000 pounds of total emissions were released. The site was shut down for almost 6 months. So that means you have all the workforce there not able to work at the facility. And then Enterprise incurred an expense of $10.4 million due to the fire response activities, and another non-cash loss of $7.1 million as a consequence of this incident. So really a very costly incident here. Now this looks a little bit busy, but I just wanted to show you, this is directly out of the Chemical Safety Board report. And I'll provide the link for that if you want to look for it and look more in detail on here. I just wanted to show you how thorough the CSB is with their investigations. So they looked at the beginning at overpressurization and see if that could have been a problem with the aluminum conductor steel reinforced equipment, and they ruled that out. Then they looked at water accumulation, ice formation, and you think about that, it's not a big deal, freezing pipes and things like that, that's such a big thing in Texas. But I know in Oklahoma, as you go further north, it does become an issue when you have freezing pipes. But they looked at that and they determined that that was not a contributing cause to the accident. Then they looked at thermal shock based on, they had a distributed control system data input that they looked at, and they determined that that was not, thermal shock was not the cause of the incident. And then they looked at possible corrosion of the aluminum conductor steel reinforced equipment. And they even did metallurgical testing on that to see if there was anything that might have caused an incident, and that was ruled out. And then they even looked at mercury embrittlement of the two trains with metallurgical testing, and they determined that that was not a cause of the incident. Then they finally looked at thermal fatigue in several areas, including the core heat exchanger, and they determined that was the cause of the incident. The heat exchanger is heated or cooled in parts or expanded and contracted together as the aluminum parts push and pull again parts of each other, they create cracks and thermal fatigue. So if you remember from your basic chemistry, biochemistry class in high school, you think when you heat something, when you cool it, you got that expansion, and that's what happened here, but on a larger scale. This is just kind of looking back at this incident and then kind of overlaying it with the risk management program on what the facility could have done better. So they could have looked at their offsite consequence analysis a little bit better, make sure that they had a proper worst case scenario, determine if you remember the incident had noted they had 13 ruptures. So facility under the regulations are only required to do one piece of equipment for the worst case scenario. Here you had multiple pieces of equipment, multiple ruptures, multiple explosions. So maybe they should have looked at that a little bit more. Their management to oversee the implementation of the RMP regulations, who exactly was responsible for overseeing the RMP program. Maybe they could have more staff, maybe more technical training, things like that. And then the core part of this, the prevention program. Now you remember the Bhopal incident and the regulations that triggered that. So if you look at how could they have improved their prevention program, they could have had more safety information out there. They could have done maybe a better process hazard analysis, hazard review. They could have focused on operating procedures a little bit better, even though I did mention they did a good job on their control room operating procedures, but maybe there's other procedures to be looked at. Training is also critical, but the primary one is the one there in the middle about maintenance of mechanical integrity. That was really the critical flaw in the proper inspection of the heat exchangers. If those would have been done more frequently to identify the cracks, then that would have prevented this incident. And that could have been prevented if they would have done compliance audits, which I've mentioned earlier, are required every 3 years, where companies get a team of their own people. Doesn't necessarily need to be people from that plant, but at least somebody who's had some experience in the industry to go through and look at what compliance audits they can do to make things a little bit better. And then their incident investigation that followed up, maybe they could have done that better. And then their emergency response. Now, I don't have a lot of information on their emergency response, but we would look at, did they have a good plan? Did they notify the public? And I know that the actual report does notice some things in there about emergency response. So that could have been done better also. So this is right out of the CSB report, and it shows in here, just I want to highlight just a few things here. And as you remember, CSB, they're out to make recommendations and findings. They're not a regulatory agency. So one of their key findings, as you would expect, that they're saying, well, you need to revise the brazed aluminum heat exchanger guidance and make sure that things are operated safe, and maintenance of all these heat exchangers to identify thermal fatigue hazards. So that was one of their things. And it should include information for both minor leaks and catastrophic failures. And they also recommended clarification on the placement of temperature and pressure sensors, which could impact the accumulation of thermal fatigue in the facility. And then to develop a new bulletin to incorporate all the lessons learned and share that with not only their company people, but other people in the industry. And then develop a database for operators to submit industry learning and analysis. And when it comes to emergency response, of course, it's coordinating with what I mentioned earlier, local emergency planning committee, and making sure working with the industry and folks in those things. But one of the key, and I think this is the first report that I ever saw that actually specifically mentioned the use of social media in an emergency response. So the CSB is saying the company should use social media to notify the public and make sure people, especially around the facility, are aware of what's going on, to disseminate that safety information. This is the actual link for the report. And then there's a link here for more information about the RMP program. Quickly, just to sum up, some of the time, sometimes, EPA and other agencies, something catastrophic happens, what happens? The regulations get tightened up. So these are just some regulations here that are going to be happening here in the near future, like December 19, 2023. There'll be a requirement to develop exercise plans and schedules. Same day, conduct first notification drills. Now, these are companies that are subject to the RMP regulations, most likely the Program 3 facilities. And then there's going to be a requirement to conduct first field exercises. Now, there's not a date on that, but it has to be a schedule that's coordinated with emergency response folks. And then there's going to be a submission which is going to require the RMP to include some additional information. And as I mentioned earlier, RMP being a document heavy regulation, is going to be more requirements. Are going to be not requirements, but more noting in the RMP about additional information. And finally, yeah, if you've got any questions or and we can't have really, if you don't think of anything or today or want to email me, I'm always up free to.
I know you don't let you get that easy.
And I'm on LinkedIn too, so.